quick note before we begin. I've opted to use a contemporary Western framework for gender roles and expression in this talk, as it is the most familiar to those sitting in front of me now. Gender is a social construct, and entirely at the whims of social norms and expectations. What was considered feminine at one point in time became considered masculine at another, and vice versa. As it stands, most of the academic study of the medieval period utilizes this largely binary framework because of the influence and dominance of the early modern Christian worldview, with its somewhat static gender role attribution that continues to influence the world we live in today. As I will go on to discuss, this was far from uniform across the period and across geography. Death. It is a universal constant. All things experience a beginning and an end. Nothing is truly infinite, even if their lifespans are expansive and far, far beyond our own perspective. It can be no surprise, then, that across all cultures and civilizations, there has been an awareness, a representation, a personification, a symbol, a recognition, a ritual, around and involving death. It is omnipresent, it is resting in the periphery of all of our existences, unavoidable as much as we try to avoid it. When presented in Western cultures, death is often terrible. It is a monumental loss and equally something that shouldn't be discussed. It is hidden away, it is skirted around, it is concealed. It's little wonder then that hell's name means exactly that, to conceal, to bury, to hide underground. She oversees the mundane, overwhelming reality of death, the deaths that are not glorious or seen as being in purpose of something greater. You can see how, in a distorted world where Valhalla is seen as the ultimate reward, a heavenly paradise, that everything else is seen as lesser and unwanted, even if that image of Valhalla was a relatively late addition into the mythos. As David Farley points out, it's also interesting that within the Nordic world, Odin remains a masculine outlier among the deities strongly tied to death. This is a world that is intriguingly dominated by feminine beings, Hel, Ran, Freyja, the Valkyries, and the Nornir being the most prominent among them. Of course, Odin himself is far from the epitome of absolute masculinity. However, I want to take a little step back and take a look at how death is perceived by other Western cultures. What we find is often a collage of juxtaposition and contradiction. Take, for instance, the inspiration behind the title of this talk, the Latin word for death, mors, which is a feminine noun. Yet death itself was rarely depicted as a woman in Roman art, and indeed was even equated with explicitly masculine deities such as Pluto, Mars, and Orcus. Compare this with muerte, the Spanish word for death, again a feminine noun, and the prevalence of a feminine death in the cultures associated with that language, particularly in South America. What is important to note here specifically is that languages change and shift over time, and so the depiction of death is better analysed through cultural memory over language. In countries where Christianity entered early, especially in Germanic countries, death is more commonly depicted as masculine, though there are notable examples in the historical timeline of a feminine death, and these reflect largely misogynistic movements, notably later medieval Augustinian Christianity, to frame Eve as the originator of the sin of death, replacing Adam. Here, Eve becomes the symbol of sin, a lustful, evil, death-bringing temptress. From the 1500s and during the Renaissance, a fascination with classical antiquity brought about a resurgence in feminine death depictions, with creatives inspired by the Hellenic fates, the Furies and Harpies. These beings, especially the latter two, carry notable negative connotations, reflecting a cultural perception that death was violent, evil, furious, sudden, whimsical, and devastating. Consider also that within Christianity, the figure of Jesus Christ epitomizes life, overcoming death to gain eternal life. Before the 14th century, you can clearly see the influence of this perspective in framing death as this pitiful creature, cowering and powerless in the face of the miracle and power of the Christian God and his Holy Son. Death is therefore seen as evil, the antithesis of everything the figure of Jesus represents. In these early Christianized countries, as we move further from the 14th century and past economic instability, war, plagues, and so on, death evolves to take on a more powerful position. No longer is death the demon cowering in the light of optimistic Christianity, but the noble warrior riding on a pale horse. Removed from this optimism and faced with the reality of death that existed all around them, striking down the young and the old, the rich and the poor equally, death became powerful and so dignified, royal, and with that designation, undoubtedly masculine in the mindset of the people. It's this representation that remains steadfast over time in continental Germanic Europe and the UK, only occasionally peppered with depictions of feminine death that are notable because they are countercultural. To give broad strokes binary observations of this environment, with the exception to the classical inspirations, there is a pattern for the feminine to be related to life, birth, beginnings, while masculine tends to refer to things that end life, such as war. We have many examples of this sort from the early Middle Ages, framing vita, life, as a woman, and mors, death, as a man. As useful as these sorts of analyses are, it also acts to obfuscate nuance. After all, how common is it for people to recognise that the Norse world doesn't follow that convention? Today's popular Western media, taking inspiration from the past, tends towards masculine, though there are notable examples here too of feminine representations of death, especially in the last century. Spoilers here for Agatha all along. Sorry in advance. What is of note within this depiction is the focus on the life-aiding cyclical aspects of death. Death here is given a name while she masquerades as a human, Rio Vidal, which means approximately through Spanish and Latin, river of life. Rio calls herself and is referred to as the Green Witch. This appears to be a common unification in uniting the typically masculine and feminine aspects of life and death to reconcile the ideas surrounding a feminine death. An agent that reinforces the cyclical nature of life and death, of life feeding death feeding life. Something that drives the continuation of the cosmos. As it stands, this depiction of feminine death in Agatha all along follows the Marvel comics it is adapted from, though there the aspect of feminine death follows more conventional justifications, and that she is desired by masculine entities. She dons the image of death, the bride. The feminine death is often clothed in erotic dressings, desired, lustful, beckoning, sinful, singing a siren's song. An evil that pretends to be good and pure and virtuous, calling back to the later image of Eve being the temptress that embraced sin and so brought death into the world. Within Marvel Comics, Thanos tries to court death and wipes out half the universe to try and impress her. Needless to say, I enjoyed the switch they conducted with Agatha all along, in making her a previous love interest in the titular Agatha, which, dare I say, offered far more depth in terms of adding character to the story being told. What I will say is that there appears to be an explicit movement towards de-demonizing death as a force for evil in modern popular content, replacing that with an explicitly sympathetic character doing simply what must be done. This is a continuation of the movement we've seen historically and throughout art, moving from god to demon, to cowering pitiful creature, to noble warrior, to a mournful friend bound by duty or cosmic law. If you've seen the ending of Agatha all along, you know how that ties into the latter. I want you to remember this idea of duty and doing what must be done. It's something I gave considerable thought to when I was writing on Skuld, potentially being seen as a death deity. During Winter Nights 2023, I was writing a chapter for the Valkyrie book, a chapter on Skuld's role that was later adapted into a paper that was published in Heathenry, the International Journal for Heathen Research. Plug. When I showed it to one of the AUK community, he made an observation that had passed by me like a ship in the night. I'd been swimming around it without making the direct connection. The way I was describing Skuld's duty was remarkably similar to the way the Grim Reaper is depicted in the modern zeitgeist, a symbol of death just collecting what was due, the debt we must all pay, the necessity. We're all familiar with this image of the hooded, anonymous, cloaked, hidden being who carries a scythe, a tool for harvest, indiscriminately reaping souls in broad swathes, like wheat from the land. What I hadn't previously given much thought to were the associations presented here. A harvest is a hallmark of fertility, a land of riches and hard work, of nurturing the land, being plucked and taken so that people could endure. There's something essential in that action, something cyclical, continuous, as it must be for life to survive and thrive. The Grim Reaper, then, is depicted as a farmer, the everyman. Far from a royal figure, it wears no finery, no crown. It is doing a job every day. This figure no doubt belongs to the other. There's no mistaking the skeletal image of this death. Something clearly not human, but personified through duty. A figure that is, I would argue, sympathetic, and only more and more so in cultural understanding. Now let's take a look at the early medieval Nordic world, which is fascinating because the concept of death is multifaceted and captured in almost all of the ways I've covered here at the same time. Cyclical, royal, mournful, hidden, glorious, and mundane reality. It is also, as touched on, predominantly feminine. Let's start with perhaps the most obvious starting point, with two gods who seem in direct juxtaposition, Odin and Hel. One represents the kingly, noble presentation of death, the other the common reality. Together they represent a notable class disparity in the perception of death, a story of wealth, privilege, power, versus poverty and everyone else. One is the glory of death, the other the life taken too soon or without pomp. One resides in a golden hall, the other in a world of mist beneath the roots of the tree. One is chosen, made special through selection by gilded ring-adorned women and uplifted to a world of mead and meat. The other takes a journey down through an unknown land, to a goddess who is often sidelined, ignored and villainized. One has an entry criterion that is purposefully exclusive, the other quite the opposite. One is for the kings, and within the literature almost always those of royal blood, the other the everyman. Odin represents the noble death, seated on a high throne with power over life and death. Hel, the death that comes for most of us, quiet, in the shadows, unexpected, sudden, lonely, almost delicate, a whisper instead of a bang. Dark Mother always gliding near with soft feet, as Walt Whitman so lyrically stated. Stalking and ever present, though not sinister, almost welcoming and perhaps equally unwilling in this duty. These are the dualities of death in the Nordic realm, and as we move further into the written record, one becomes equated with heaven and the other hell. One is seen as good, the other is evil. But let's be clear here. Odin is the anomaly in the Nordic realm. His role in all of this, and phrased similarly though we're not given much detail, feels like an interference. Something that was added in at some point in the mythic timeline, something not strictly of the natural order. After all, Odin is amassing forces for Ragnarok. Valhalla is not an afterlife in the conventional sense, but a training ground of endless resurrection. He has implemented it, imposing his will, as he does frequently in the literature, to achieve a goal. Valhalla is an addition, something that wouldn't exist if Odin was taken out of the equation. Hell, which I'll just call Helheim from here on in for clarity, is a place of overwhelming mortality. So unlike Valhalla, which represents continuous resurrection and renewal, rejuvenation, so like Idun's apples on the Aesir themselves, where Valhalla is shining and golden, godly even, Snorri's depiction of Helheim is miserable, sickly, and sleet-spattered. While the mythic timeline is nebulous, a state of happening, happened, and will happen, one conclusion we could make is that the concept of Helheim as a place for the mortal dead existed before Hel was given dominion over it, with Odin essentially assigning her to oversee it, to exert some aspects of control over a place that was otherwise so antithetical to a god, a place emblematic of mortality. It needed a paradox given form, a goddess with 1 foot in the realm of immortality and 1 foot in the realm of mortality, everlasting life and continuous enduring death. Hel is liminal by her very nature, between worlds and belonging to none. You can imagine how her appearance and the ramifications of her existence was as astonishing to the Aesir as her ever-growing wild siblings, something potentially dangerous to the order of the world they had created, something, dare I say, that could be seen as monstrous. Imagine that Hel was a reminder, an omen perhaps that Odin could not ignore or avoid the jaws of fate forever. She had to be thrown into Niflheim, to be hidden. It's a very human response, a need to conceal or push aside thoughts of our ultimate end. This idea of liminality, of being between worlds, is shared between many of the feminine death deities I will be talking about today. In the pre-Christian beliefs of the North, water was seen as a space between worlds, of being both sacred and mundane. Lakes, wells, springs, ponds, rivers, and the ocean. The Whale Road, the Ring of Islands, the Road of Ran, Ran's world. Interestingly, Ran appears in kennings for the sea more so than her husband, the Jotun Aegir. Perhaps more interesting than that is that she's never mentioned as a giantess, a Jotun herself. Snorri lists her among the Alcinja, the goddesses, though admittedly Skadi is too, and Gertha. What we may conclude is a rarity in the literature, a goddess becoming wilder and Jotun-like through a movement away from the Aesir and into the Jotnar. It's far more common for the reverse to be true, and Ran may be a considerable outlier here, highly unusual. Where Ran is attested in the literature, it is often framed within the context of death. Unfair death, untimely death, death at the hands of forces so beyond our control, which falls in line with other figures mentioned in this talk, but also the Jotnar as a whole. A name's etymology is also overwhelmingly negative, meaning theft, plunder, robbery, the taking of life from those unwilling to die. Her selection takes no consideration of blood or honour, like Valhalla, or intent. A warrior expects death on the battlefield, is prepared for it. The same can't be said for the sea, though it's clear the danger Ran represented was present in tacit knowledge. Death could come from anywhere, and the sea was extraordinarily dangerous, a place humanity cannot control. You can see parallels here with the way death was represented during the Black Death in the 14th century, powerful, omnipresent, and unstoppable. The message is clear. The wild is a dangerous place and dominated by forces so beyond human comprehension. This idea is at the heart of the word troll and troll-like. It's a word that encompasses this notion of things that are inhuman, something other, something that exists in the wild but is able to cross over into spaces of human activity, or indeed a warning to not cross into the unknown and the uncontrolled. Yes, it's time. Let's talk about the Valkyries, who continue on this line of liminality. After all, they have experienced a journey of domestication from monstrous demon of carnage to the noble daughters of kings, the royal protectors of heroes. In the former, they share similarities with the classical Furies, though without the focus on specific individuals or an aspect of vengeance. They are duty-bound, overseeing the liminal battlefield space to choose those who die and choose those who live. That is their role. Their choices are not personal, unlike, say, the Furies who are incited to action through perceived injustice. And the battlefield is their temple, their realm, where blood is spilled and lives ended en masse. I've written in the past about how I see the Valkyries as ritual priestesses of the battlefield, tying into the role and descriptor of Disir, managing the sacrifices of a space that is so wild and animalistic, yet exists within the confines of civilization. For as long as we have been, we have warred. We have set boundaries of us and them. The nature of the self, to paraphrase Simone de Beauvoir, is defined as much as by what we are as what we are not. The battlefield is a liminal environment, a clash of oppositions, and a threshold where life and death is determined on the edge of a spear or sword. Death can come suddenly, and no one is powerful enough to stop the forces at work. A warrior is always prepared for death, because it can come for them at any time, and when the Valkyries aside, fate is set in motion. Moreover, it's important to note that the Valkyries are active agents of death operating on a landscape that is often seen as overwhelmingly masculine. Indeed, I would argue that the Nordic battlefield is incorrectly seen as a masculine space too. The inclusion of the Valkyries seems like such an unusual element within this schema that their role is often downplayed and sidelined in favour of Odin. But there's a pattern emerging here that I hope is becoming evident. When it comes to the maintenance or end of mortal life, feminine beings are often at play. In another reality, I would no doubt expect the Valkyries to appear in medieval art to represent death on a larger scale. However, the mythology of the Norse was only seen as something of interest and merit from the 18th century, with Heimskringla and Snorri's manuscripts of the Edda being translated completely in the 17th century. The Renaissance was the rebirth of classical inspiration, a look back at the golden age of art and literature. It was only much later in the Victorian era that the Nordic world would experience a similar rebirth into cultural awareness, born in part by the Nordicist movement and a nationalist need to reclaim a past that never existed in the first place. As Skuld is listed among the Valkyries, I embrace an absolutely seamless segue to talk about the Nornir. In academic and popular thought, the Nornir are frequently equated with the Hellenic fates. And while I've previously argued that to equate them to the idea of past, present, and deterministic future is not an accurate representation of the Nordic beliefs around fate, I do believe it's no coincidence that the Hellenic fates share a strong association with death, especially in the minds of late medieval Europe. Three feminine beings held separate from the gods themselves. The prevailing theory, after all, is that the Norni are from Jotunheim, who have knowledge or indeed direct control over the life and death of all they oversee. Within later medieval art, the Hellenic fates became common inclusions to represent death, often on a chariot pulled by oxen, rolling over the bodies of those they had claimed. Atropos is given a central role here, armed with her scissors, cutting the threads of life of the old and the young, the wealthy and the poor. Fate comes for us all. Death comes for us all. And all of our fates lead to one thing, a necessary thing. With the beginning of life, the earth that we are assigned at its very beginning, we are put on a path. The choices and free will and the opportunity to forge our own way with consideration of what has been passed down to us. Our orlog, but it is finite. That is our debt. That is necessity. Skald's name means debt, should be. This is where the similarity with the Hellenic fates meets a diverging fork in the road. Skald's counterpart, Atropos the string cutter, is absolute and deterministic by definition. The Hellenic fates create, measure, and cut the thread of life. The Norni are never depicted in ways which reflect that aspect in the Nordic world, and rather seem to be most involved at the very start. The only absolute here is that death comes for us all. Skald will have the blood payment that is promised at Eartha's actions and the gift of fate at a life's beginning. Personally, I also hold an opinion that most of the goddesses have some role or latent association with death, even those more commonly seen as life-giving or representing fertility. Take, for instance, the goddess whose name I took in her honour. Sif. At first glance, she represents the idea of the harvest, cough, Grim Reaper cough, of fertility, of nourishment. She's the mother of Ula, Morti, and Thrúða. She's arguably quite passive in the literature, with her most prominent appearance being the loss of her hair at the hands of Loki. But there's little fragments in the corpus that her role in story is far greater than this singular story. Perhaps most obviously is that her history remains a mystery, epitomised through the existence of her son Ula. Who is his father? We don't know. But I've always considered it interesting that Ula shares similarities with Skadi. The skiing and hunting aspects, absolutely, but also considering Skadi's influence of oath-keeping and lawful action, which I will touch on more in a moment. Sif also has a kenning that ties her directly to behaviours attributed exclusively to the Jotnar. Lit vas soti Sifjas vang. The horse of Sif was hardly hungry. This horse, a steed, a mount, is a wolf. Riding wolves is a behaviour only exhibited to the Jotnar. These are the wild counterparts of horses, representing that space and its danger, the wild, unpredictable reflection. Hyrrokkin at Baldur's funeral is perhaps the most obvious example of this type. They sent to Jotunheim for a certain giantess named Hyrrokkin, who came mounted on a wolf, having twisted serpents for a bridle. We have presumed Jotun Valkyries who also ride wolves, such as Gunnar. There also lies some confusion, raised by Rudolf Simek among many others, about whether Jarnsaxa, the mother of Thor's other son Magni, and a giantess, was actually separate from Sif at all, with Sif being a Hati for Jarnsaxa, or Jarnsaxa a Hati for Sif. With deepest irony, it could be that the Marvel depiction of Sif as a fearless warrior in the battlefield is closer to the earliest incarnation of her, which I find very funny. Potentially the Sif we know today is the image of a goddess whose edges were made smooth and more palatable in a converting world, removed from her diverging aspects and made solely into a mother and wife, victimized through Loki's actions. It is a common conclusion to associate the Jotnar with death. They often appear at times of death. At the very least, they can be seen as an oppositional force of attrition, ultimately also embodying the aspects of the destructive end of Ragnarok. Their actions in the literature also act to strip away elements of protection or advantage. The builder and his wall desiring Freya, who could be seen as a sort of boon to the Aesir, considering it was she who taught Odin the greatest power, Seidr. Idun's capture by the hands of Thiazi temporarily removed the Aesir's eternal youth, if not their immortality. Taking Mjolnir, a weapon which not only had killed so many of their kin, but would also go some way to limit or entirely remove the Aesir's most powerful combatant. I do want to emphasise here that, as someone who worships the Jotnar, they shouldn't be considered evil. Merely the opposite to the Aesir, the flipped coin, the other half, the balance. We have so many examples of Jotun who are not antagonistic to the Aesir, and indeed if my theory that Sif was historically considered one of the Jotnar holds ground, then she also embodies this element of wildness, of the outside, that has been brought into the fold, accepted, and ultimately domesticated. But I will finish this talk by discussing another one. Let's talk about Skadi. The spectre of death looms over her. Grief fuels her. It is the loss of her father that drives her to march on Asgard in pursuit of appropriate wergild. Rightful action bookends her appearances. She appears before the Aesir demanding justice for the murder of her father, and she ultimately gets that justice when Loki is punished at the end of Lokasenna. It is she, after all, that first mentions he will be tied down by his son's entrails before the act occurred, and it was she who placed the serpent above his head. The words she uses in these exchanges are similar to other examples of an oath being made, with promises of cold counsel and hostility. Loki becomes an outlaw with his words and actions, unprotected by the law, and Skadi acts on it. Her name means harm, damage, and darkness. Her home is Thrymheimer, Thunderhome, among the mountains and forests of Jotunheim. She is an outside element, one of the Jotnar, who were incorporated into the Aesir, seemingly remaining allies with them even after her marriage to Njortha dissolves, though again we have to consider mythic time here. And look at this, I've managed to segue back to something that was related to Agatha all along. Skadi, like the Norn Skald and the mortal sorcerer Skald of the saga of Hrolf Kraki, has a sense of debt about her, the waiting vengeance, tempered perhaps, temporarily quenched but persistent and unavoidable. She is moved to action through grief, death, but no doubt is an agent of it too through these actions, but also through her role as a hunter. She is the friend of wolves, the vengeant Var of the bowstring, taking her time, but always lethal. These goddesses and giantesses, overwhelmingly feminine figures, oversee death. They represent the temporary nature of life, or they explicitly dole out death. It is a facet of life. Life feeds death, feeds life, in a continuous cycle. That, in my belief, is the central order and law in the universe. In my heathen practice, which features the goddesses and giantesses heavily, I consider the recognition of death and how it impacts the human condition to be important. In previous centuries, death has been seen, largely as a result of the religious beliefs of the time, as a wholly negative thing, something born or created by evil and with evil intentions. That's far from my belief. I hope this talk has given you some things to think about, specifically when it comes to the role of the goddesses and giantesses in the Nordic literature, and further within heathen beliefs. The role of death too, the importance of it, as much as we want to turn away, run, hide from it. It can be beautiful, it can be brutal, it can be peaceful, sudden, unexpected, cruel, kind, devastating, mindless, unpredictable, chaotic. But it is necessary, as is life. Thank you.